All right, welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. So I have a very good video here today. This one's probably going to even be better than my last few, which I made to address Tovia Singer. This one here, the evidence for it is just so hard-hitting and one after the other. So uh, Tovia Singer is basically famous for teaching that the Apostle Paul brought a whole new religion. I mean, he and others also go on a tangent, say that Paul taught different than Jesus. Tovia Singer has many videos like this on his channel. And this isn't an issue localized to Tovia Singer, because basically any rabbi in Judaism would say the same thing. It's the opinion of Judaism, but it's an erroneous opinion that I will debunk utterly in this video here. There's no room for argument. Tovia Singer, I really hope that you watch this. There is absolutely no comeback you could have to this here. I have 25 verses right off the bat. There's actually 35 that I could read, but 25 verses from Paul's own mouth, which prove that Tovia is absolutely backwards wrong. Okay, so what Judaism and Tovia Singer always say is that Paul taught that the law of Judaism is dead and gone. They claim that Paul taught that it is useless. It's dead and dying. It's been replaced. They ascribe all sorts of adjectives to it that they misappropriate and lift from the pages of the New Testament. So nonetheless, I'm not going to deny that Paul wrote very complex. I mentioned that in my systematic theology, okay? And there's even verses in the New Testament which say that Paul's words are hard to hear, they're hard to understand. And what everybody has to understand first is that Paul, he wrote a lot of the New Testament, and almost all the things that he wrote, his books, were actually letters to fellow theologians. They weren't meant to be read by the common public. They're worded very haughty and high, and it's not easy for somebody. I mean, I've been studying it 20 years, and it's still very hard. You have to go very, very slow, go word for word in the original translation, even in the original language, in order to comprehend it properly. But more importantly, you have to have a full understanding of the New Testament and true Christianity as a whole before you start making misappropriated calculations on what you think Paul taught. Okay, so what Judaism and Rabbi Tovia Singer are guilty of is being backwards wrong on Paul. I could school everybody here, and I will. So the reality is, as I've said before, and as I prove in my systematic theology, which is available on Amazon, the original Christianity, as the Bible teaches, okay, is that the law of Sinai, the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, is still binding for Jews. This is what New Testament theology teaches. I prove it in my systematic theology. I have some evidence here to prove that as well tonight. But Christianity, the real Christianity, actually teaches that the Jewish law is binding for Jews. And it teaches that the Gentile law is binding for Gentiles. It also teaches that Gentiles must not keep the Jewish law, okay? These are the exact same principles that Judaism teaches. Judaism, if you ask any rabbi, they would tell you, oh, well, the Jewish law is always going to be here. God's not ever going to do away with it until he recreates the heavens and the earth, right? That's what Christianity actually teaches. And if you ask Judaism, what are Gentiles supposed to keep? Judaism would tell you, oh, well, they're supposed to keep Gentile law. That's how they come to God. That's exactly what Christianity actually teaches, okay? Christianity does not teach that the law of Moses was dead, gone, done away with, annulled, replaced, any of those buzzwords. Those are absolute atrocious misappropriations of the text. So, like I said, the following 25 verses that I have here, there's even more. This is just a selection of 25 from Paul's own mouth, where he says with his own mouth that the law of Judaism is binding and in effect, and that all Jews must keep it. Okay? And I have a section at the end where it gets into Gentiles and what they're supposed to do. And nobody, Tovia Singer himself included, could hear this blatant evidence, okay, and say that I'm wrong. Absolutely not. The only escape they could have, right? And I'm telling you now, this is what he would do, is he would say, oh, well, the reason why it appears to say that here and it appears to say something contrary elsewhere, is just because the New Testament and Paul is just a bunch of nonsense, and they contradict each other, and they contradict themselves. That's not true. Okay, I could turn this into, but I'm not going to, a 2 or 3 hour long video where I expand and expound upon all the things and the controversial statements that Paul made. I do that with a lot of his statements in my systematic theology. And when you get down to the nitty gritty, when you're being actually academic about it and you're looking at the original translation of the New Testament, even the original languages, often truth is hidden away in the original language because translating into other languages often obscures the original meaning. And I have two beautiful examples of that here, of how Judaism and Christians and Tovia Singer have misappropriated an improper translation here. I could show that as evidence against Christianity, right? They use it against Christianity, but they're not even looking at what the actual Greek says. So the Greek says something completely opposite. So altogether here, this is 25 verses, literally from Paul's mouth, claiming that the Jewish law is in effect and mandatory for Jews, and that they must keep it, and that Gentiles must keep the Gentile law. And there's nobody could hear this and say that, oh, well, no, Paul taught that the law is replaced and dead and gone. No, you're wrong. All the buzzwords that Paul used talking about, this is saving a 2 hour long video, right? But all the places where Paul seems to be talking about that the law is dead and gone or produces death, you people are just not actually studying the text in its original form, and you're not reading the whole of the New Testament, and you're not reading it with the logical sound understanding where you're taking things plausibly and you're doing things plausibly. If you cherry pick things like you're pulling a rabbit out of a hat, it's easy to misappropriate something. So where Paul appears to say that the law produces death, he's not being derogatory to the law. If you read the whole context of everything, Paul, but very complicatedly, does explain that the law is good. I have these verses to read, but by keeping the law, if you offend in the law, you can receive punishment for it, even death. This is what Paul means, kind of, poetically or euphemistically, whatever the word would be, where he says that the law, I'm not quoting him, but where he says things like to the extent of, the law produces death, or I died from the law. It's not to make the law look bad. It's a stating that if you break the law, you receive these penalties. Okay. So simple things like that. People take verses and cherry pick things and then misappropriate them without understanding the whole full deep context what Paul is implying. And at the end of the day, Paul does not contradict himself. He does not contradict Jesus. He does not contradict the disciples or anything else in the New Testament. As I proved in my systematic theology, the New Testament, Jesus, Paul, and the disciples and the apostles, all of them, all categories, all conclusively agree with one another theologically. They all soundly teach the one same thing. It is not that Paul is contradicting himself. So when I read these 25 verses now where Paul is affirming the law, just know he is not going to contradict himself elsewhere and say that the law is replaced. Okay, well, I will hopefully be able to fully address this with the selection of verses that I have here. So let's begin. Okay, so in Acts 24, verse 14. Okay, and by the way, I want to mention this as well. Because Paul wrote so much of the New Testament, and because a lot of this theological concept is in the books written by Paul, everybody, whether Jew or Christian, and Tovia Singer, all wrongly assume, because they have not, properly analyzed what true Christianity, they haven't analyzed the text properly and thoroughly and academically. They're just going on loose ambiguations and on hearsay and old wives' tales about Christianity from the medieval Dark Ages. But because of that, right? I forgot where I was going with that. But anyways, let's just bear with me. Let's just go on, right? So in Acts 20, there was a reason why I was saying that. In Acts 24:14, okay, it says, "And I confess this to thee, that according to the way that they call a sect, so serve I the God of the fathers, believing all things that in the law and the prophets have been written." So here Paul is confessing that he believes, he follows Judaism. Next verse, Acts 21, verse 20. "And they, having heard, were glorifying the Lord. They also said to him, Thou seest, brother, how many myriads there are of Jews who have believed and are zealous of the law." Now, isn't this ironic? How could a Jewish person believe in Jesus as Messiah, but yet still keep Judaism. How? Well, because that's how actual Christianity works. If you look at historians, history, they even record, I'm not making it up, the original Christians, early Christians, the vast majority of them were actually Jews who kept Judaism, but they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. How is that possible? Well, because Jesus, the Messiah, taught Judaism for Jews and Gentile law for Gentiles. And if you want to get salvation, you have to keep the law that God gave you. That's what Jesus taught. That's how the early Christians could actually be Jews, keeping Judaism, but yet still, following Christ. So, but that's what Tovia Singer and most of the world doesn't even realize, because everybody doesn't want to look at what the actual Bible says. They just want to go by hearsay. So anyways, right? So again, it said, thou seest, brother, how many myriads there are of Jews who have believed and are all zealous of the law. Next, in Acts 21:24, it says, these having taken, be purified with them, and be at expense with them, that they may shave the head, and all may know that the things which have been instructed concerning thee are nothing, but thou dost walk thyself also the law keeping. Now let me add a bit of light on the context here. This is in the famous chapters I always talk about from the book of Acts, which Paul wrote, okay, where the Jews, the Christians, Gentiles, were all getting together and they were debating over theology. Who should believe what? And in those chapters 15, I think, through 21, okay, and I have some of the verses here today, they literally specify that Jewish law is for Jews and they have to keep it, and that Gentile law is for Gentiles, and that Gentiles shouldn't keep Jewish law. So this is from those very chapters here, okay? And they, some people, if you read the chapters, were saying that the Gentiles should be circumcised. And the Jews are pointing out, no, because they're not Jewish, they shouldn't get circumcised. They could if they want to, but it's not mandatory law, and they shouldn't be keeping Jewish law. I mean, this is literally what you see in the chapters there, right? And I don't think there's any rabbi today that would argue with those precepts that Jews should keep Judaism and Gentiles shouldn't keep Judaism, they should keep Gentile law. That's literally what's talking about in the chapters there. So everybody was discussing and debating who should keep what. So when Paul recorded here, where he says, and all may know that the things of which they have been instructed concerning thee are nothing. So what he's saying is, ignore all this debate that you see taking place in those chapters of who should keep what. Ignore all of that. And his synopsis here is that, all these things that they're instructing you are nothing, but thou does walk thyself also the law keeping. So he gets over that hurdle saying, look, ignore all that nonsense. You're supposed to be keeping the law. Okay? Now in Acts 25:8, Paul was making defense of himself before, I think it was the Roman Empire. He, making defense, said, neither in regard to the law of the Jews, nor in regard to the temple, nor in regard to Caesar, did I commit any sin. So this is Paul testifying that he kept the law of the Jews. Now, if Paul was a Christian ready to die for Jesus, why would he say that if Christianity was something different than what Judaism actually brought and taught, right? But because it's not, it is the same thing that Judaism brought and taught. It's just being reinforced by Jesus, the Messiah, but it's nothing different within itself. That's why Paul could get up there as a Jewish person, as a Jewish believer in Jesus, and still claim that he kept the law of the Jews. Right? Next, in 1 Timothy 1:8, Paul says, and we have known that the law is good, if anyone may use it lawfully. Now, why would Paul make a statement like that if Paul, or the New Testament, taught that the law is gone? Or if it taught that the law is dead or useless and this and that there. You see what I mean? People are misappropriating, cherry picking other verses, other buzzwords from verses, usually rendered into other languages, not even looking at the original languages. And they're not taking things in a broader understanding, right? The fact that Paul says 25 statements here alone out of 35 that do exist in the New Testament, affirming the law exists, how can you ignore that, right? You have to process the theological understanding. If Paul is saying that the law is good, if you may use it lawfully, that shows you, it's common sense, that the law is in effect, and this is his instruction to keep it lawfully. Next, Romans 2:13, for not the hearers of the law are righteous before God, but the doers of the law shall be declared righteous. Now, where do you hear Paul saying, oh, law doesn't save you, it's just faith. If you keep the law, you're going to die. You have to keep faith. He's not saying any of that baloney. Is he? No, he's laying down the logical theology. He says the hearers of the law aren't righteous before God, but the doers of the law shall be declared righteous. So what about all those other verses where Paul appears to say we're declared righteous by faith? We see this is what I mean. People cherry pick their readings and then misappropriate things because they don't have the broad understanding of the whole, right? I spent 20 years doing my studies in the original language and translations, and all the evidence is in the book. This is just a short video, right? So I know what I'm talking about. They misappropriated things. So again, another instruction that you're only declared righteous by following and keeping the law. Next, in Romans 2:15, it says, who do show the work of the law written in their hearts. Now, this is Jeremiah's prophecy that the law of God, whether for Jew or Gentile, will be put into your heart, and you're going to follow it there. That's the new covenant, right? This is what Paul teaches the new covenant is. In the portions in his chapters where Paul details the new covenant, he literally quotes Jeremiah. He doesn't add much to it, and he reinforces the fact that this law of God is put on our hearts and we have to keep it, right? So I don't know how anybody like Tovia Singer or anybody else out there can go and say that Paul did away with the law. He taught that the law is gone and replaced, and he taught that this new religion of Christianity replaced Judaism. That's an absolute lie. That is not what he taught. It'll appear like that if you're doing cherry picking and misappropriation, though. Okay? So, anyways, who do show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also witnessing with them, and between one another the thoughts accusing or else defending. Next, in Romans 2:25, it says, for circumcision indeed does profit, if law thou mayest practice. Now, why would Paul say that if the law is dead and gone and doesn't do any of those things and leads you to death? You see my point? Here he is once again saying that if it is in your law, i.e. if you're Jewish, to be circumcised, it profits you to practice and fulfill that law. Okay? But he points out theologically, but if a transgressor of the law, meaning if you're a member of Judaism, but you're breaking the law that you're supposed to follow, he says, but if a transgressor of law thou mayest be, thy circumcision has become as uncircumcision, meaning you're defiling it. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that statement, right? That's what's the problem with that? But people take that verse in these circumcision verses and make it look like Paul's teaching. I mean, I've heard people say it. I can't remember offhand if Tovia says this, but it wouldn't surprise me, where they say that, oh, no, Paul taught that Jews shouldn't be circumcised. It's breaking the law. That is not what he taught, right? So anyways, it's all lies. So next, in Romans 3:19, and we have known that as many things as the law saith, to those in the law it does speak, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may come under judgment to God. Here, Paul is affirming that the law of God is that binding that it judges the world. Okay, the world is bound in judgment to the law. Okay, next in Romans 3:31, law then do we make useless through the faith? Let it not be. Yea, we do establish law. And this is right after he spent a couple paragraphs appearing to say that faith trumps or replaces law. But no, it might seem like he's saying that if you're taking an uneducated or narrow-minded stance in this. Okay, if you're looking at the broader whole and you understand the entire context, you know that clearly he establishes law. He talks poetically and complex in other ways, in other places. But right there in that chapter is where Paul famously goes on about faith, and it seems like he's saying faith is better and it replaces. But at the end of it, he summarizes his point for the reader. He says, law do we make useless through the faith? Let it not be. Yea, we do establish law. So all the places where he appeared to say that, the law is weak or useless or dead and gone, don't misappropriate. You know what I mean? Don't misappropriate things. He makes it very clear with his little conclusion at the end of that passage that the law is not made useless through the faith. It is beautified by the faith. He also has another verse where he says that the faith has always been part of the law. It was a part of the law that hadn't been kept by so many people. That's why when Jesus came, he reinforced faith, because faith was one of the aspects of the law that had not been kept. It needed to be reinvigorated. That's why so much stress was put on faith. If you just keep law mechanically like a robot, but you're lacking that faith like Abraham have, then it's unfruitful. This is the essence of what Paul is relaying with all his poetic verses, right? But anyways, Romans 7:12, he says, for so that the law indeed is holy, and the command holy and righteous and good. Why would Paul say this if Paul is teaching that it's dead and gone? Right? He doesn't say that. He says that the law is holy, the command is holy and righteous and good. In Romans 7:13, that which is good then to me has become death, let it not be. You see what I mean? But all these other people out there say that, oh, Paul taught that to keep the law is death or that the law is dead. They misappropriate these buzzwords that he uses poetically. But again, Paul clarifies for his readers. He says, that which is good then to me has become death, let it not be. But the sin that it might appear, mean manifest as what it is, sin, through the good, meaning by keeping law, by having the law from God, you're being shown from God what is right and wrong. By that being manifest in your life, it manifests what is goodness and what is sin. Okay? This is what Paul means. He says, let it not be, but the sin that it might appear as sin through the good, working death to me, that the sin might become exceedingly sinful through the command. Now, Paul's not saying this because he's demonizing the law. He's saying because of the existence of God's law, it helps you identify by wisdom what sin is. Okay, so through that good thing, he identified the good thing as the law, is by that good thing that you can identify the sin. Okay, and he just points out that the sin is working death to him. Okay, there's nothing in that diminishing the law. Next, in Romans 7:22, he says, and right here, verses afterwards, Paul reaffirms a conclusion for his readers. He says, for I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. That's the new covenant written on your heart. Okay, I delight in the law of God. He is not diminishing the law. He delights in it. And then he says, and I just included this, not to make it overly complex, right? I get into this type of complexity in my book, but not for this video here. Right? But a little snippet. Paul uses the word law in many different contexts. You have to understand the setting, who he is speaking to. Okay, Paul was a Jew. He kept Jewish law, even though he was a Christian. Okay, and now we understand why that makes sense. But nonetheless, he was a Jewish person keeping Jewish law. When he taught fellow Jews, he would have to talk about them keeping the Jewish law. If he was talking to just Gentiles, he would have to talk about keeping Gentile law. And there are examples of both of these. Okay. And thirdly, if he's talking to a mixed multitude of Jew and Christian, or Jew and Gentile, sorry, what he says has to be understood in that light as well. Okay. But the average person doesn't even think about that stuff. All right. But I've got these verses here included in my lineup here, right? But the other thing is this. So when Paul says the word law, you have to understand the setting and the context. Is he talking about the Jewish law? Is he talking about the Gentile law? Is he talking about other laws, other type of things? There's earthly laws. There's bodily laws. There's all sorts of things in context that he uses. People don't, I think nobody, probably most people probably don't, bother to even think about that level of complexity when they're doing Bible study. Okay? But it's very important. Isn't it important? You know what I mean? If you apply that to nowadays life, it would be just as important, right? If you're dictating something that somebody needs to keep, if you have, say, you have a park ranger and you have a scuba diver, you're not going to dictate scuba diver details to the park ranger and park ranger details to the scuba diver, right? So if you're speaking to the scuba dive team, you're going to read from the scuba diving booklet, right? If you're talking to the park ranger team, you're going to talk from the park guide booklet, right? But people don't think about that. They just see Paul mentioning the word law, and then they're like, oh, it means this, right? Anyways, so here's an example of where Paul is talking about different forms of law, right? So he says in Romans 7:22, I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. So that's the law of God written upon their hearts, okay? Then in the following breath, he says, and I behold another law in my members. So this is illustrative proof that Paul does make reference, even within the same sentence, to more than one type of law. Is anybody out there, including Tovia, truly differentiating, which takes effort? Who is he speaking to in the necessary context when they do their studies or accusations? I don't think so. He says, I behold another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of the sin that is in my members. Now, notice all the other places where Paul seems to say that the law causes sin and that the law, and he prescribes all this badness and all that and death and stuff to it. That's why you have to stop and understand which law is he speaking about. There is a law of sinfulness that he also refers to, which is what he's talking about here. So that's what I mean. Don't cherry pick these other places where Paul mentions the word law, cherry pick it and then misappropriate it based on buzzwords you see floating around in those sentences. You have to understand the whole context. Anyways, here Paul says he delights in the law of God that's upon his heart, but he beholds another law in his members, meaning the rest of his body, right? Warring against the law of his mind and bringing him into captivity to the law of the sin that is in his members. And he says, a wretched man I am, who shall deliver me out of the body of this death? So what Paul is highlighting there theologically is that his body, he's admitting that he's a sinner, that he gives into sin. He has the law of God in his heart and his mind, and he's striving to keep it, but this law of sin that's in his members is pulling at him and tempting him. And he says, a wretched man I am, who shall deliver me out of the body of this death? So Paul is ascribing this death and this darkness to that, law of sin. And it's not a law to follow sin. That's a euphemism. It's a poetic language that he uses. He's contrasting it to the law of God. And in contrast, you would have the opposite, which would be like a law of sin. It's just poetic talk. But because he is wrongly obeying that law of sin, he has become a wretched man, and he needs deliverance from this body of death and sinfulness. Anyways, in Galatians 2:19, Paul says, for I through law did die, that to God I may live. And this makes more sense in light of what I just said. Paul saying, who shall deliver me out of the body of this death? His body is dying because he's breaking the Jewish law, and he knows it. And then Paul says in Galatians, for I through law did die, that to God I may live. He's not saying this to diminish the Jewish law. He's saying that by the presence of the wise commandments and law, he could identify that what he was doing was sin and was leading him to death. And that's why Paul is using that poetic euphemistic language, saying that through law he did die, okay, that to God he may live. Now, with Jesus in the Christian theology context applied, the whole point of the true baptism, which is reformation, is when you stop sinning and you become a new person, a new creature, reborn from above, new mind, new behavior, new conscience, right? That's what true Christianity teaches, which is what Judaism teaches to be saved, okay? Now, part of this symbolism presented in the New Testament is that Christians are to euphemistically, symbolically, themselves die with Christ at their baptism. And this isn't for any dark reason. It's so that people take the matter seriously. If you're out there doing also, and remember, all those Gentiles were Gentiles, they were pagans. They came from severe heathenism, right? And the only way to get people out of that is to teach them, look, we're not taking this like cotton candy. Like, oh, you can take your time, stop doing a sin here, abstain from this here and there, and over time you'll be okay. No. This is cut and dry. You know what I mean? It's like pulling a fish out of the water. It's a sudden change. You got to change, you got to reform, become a new person who doesn't do any of that stuff. And that type of immediate and utter and permanent separation from your old sinning self is symbolized euphemistically as dying with Christ at your baptism, so that you can be reborn with Christ at your baptism, reborn from above, blessed by the Holy Spirit of God in exchange for your reformation. And God will bless you with forgiveness of sins for your reformation. That's what the New Testament Christianity actually teaches. So when we apply that Christian understanding to this, where in Galatians 2, Paul says, for I through law did die, that to God I may live. This means that as a Jewish believer in Jesus, he knew that he must keep the Jewish law. In his fervence for keeping the Jewish law, he recognized that he also breaks the Jewish law, in that he is a sinner and will probably perish because of his sinfulness. He wants deliverance from this, not addiction, but he wants deliverance from this addiction to this downwards path, okay? The only way that he could get out of that is by reforming. And by reforming, he puts to death symbolically his old self, meaning that old sinning self ceases to be. It never operates again. And that's why Paul says, for I through law did die, that to God I may live. Okay? It's not because he's demonizing the Jewish law. Thank you. Romans 8:4, Paul says that the righteousness of the law may be fulfilled in us. Again, why would Paul say this if he taught that the law is dead and gone? He says that the righteousness of the law may be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Next, in Romans 8:7, Paul says, because the mind of the flesh is enmity, adversary to God, for to the law of God it does not subject itself. So here, Paul again is adding on another layer of theological confirmation that to keep the law of God is good, to break the law of God makes you an adversary to God, because you're rejecting God and his word and his law, right? Next, Romans 10:4, Paul says, for Christ is an end of law for righteousness to everyone who is believing. Now, I just want to stop there. This is one of the places, okay, where I said at the start in my intro that probably the churches altered the words that are actually in the original to suit their church doctrines. But unfortunately, it's duped everyone else around the world who on looks, who doesn't do arduous enough study. We get people such as Tovia Singer coming out saying that, oh, well, the New Testament and Jesus and Paul taught that, he's now starting to agree that Jesus didn't teach that the law is gone. But anyways, or maybe he always taught that, right? But he recognizes that. But my point is he's out there saying that Christianity and Paul did away with the law and taught that, right? And people use this verse as an example of that. Even churches do. They say that Christ is an end of law for righteousness to everyone who is believing. But it doesn't say what you think it says in your English bastardized Bibles. In the original Greek, the word that is used means to keep, to fulfill. So it doesn't even say end. They just changed it into the English word end to make it look like Jesus put an end to the law. But that's not true. So the actual original text says, for Christ is a fulfillment, i.e., an honoring and keeping of law for righteousness to everyone who is believing. So you see what I mean? It's the exact opposite of what everybody's been claiming, including Tovia, in effect. Okay, so Paul does not say that the law is dead and gone, okay, and that, if you have Jesus and the faith in Jesus, that replaces the law. That's not what he said at all. He said that Jesus keeps the law of righteousness and that this is an inspiration for everyone who is believing. So if you believe in God and you believe in Jesus, Jesus, by his keeping of the law, inspires you, therefore, to keep the law. That's what Paul said, right? So don't misappropriate what Paul's teaching. And next, Paul, again, sums it up for the reader. In the next breath, he says, for Moses does describe the righteousness that is of the law, that the man who did them shall live in them. So how could anybody say I'm wrong? I know I'm not wrong, right? Everybody else is backwards. That's the problem. You got people out there like Tovia saying, oh, Paul taught the law is dead and gone. I mean, just this one verse. For Christ is a fulfillment of law. He's a keeping of law for righteousness to everyone who is believing. For Moses does describe the righteousness that is of the law, that the man who did them shall live in them. So by doing the law, by keeping the law, you are righteous. That goes against what Tovia and everybody else says about Paul. They say, oh, no, only faith makes you righteous. That's not true, right? You got Paul's own mouth saying these things right here, right? Next one, Romans 13:8. Paul says, to no one owe anything except to love one another, for he who is loving the other, law he has fulfilled. Okay, so why would Paul say this if there's no law, if it's just faith? Why would he give instruction to keep law like this? Romans 13:10, in like fashion, the love to the neighbor does work no ill. The love, therefore, is the fullness of law. Fullness meaning the keeping and the honoring, the upkeep of law. In 1 Corinthians 9:8, Paul says, according to man do I speak these things, or does not also the law say these things? So here we have Paul referring people authoritatively to the law. Okay, in Ephesians 6:1, Paul says, the children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is righteous. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live a long time upon the land. Now, we don't have to fuss over the micro issue of whether he said the first command or not. First, I bet you if you looked up in the Greek, he's just using that term first as this is the first one that he's talking about in his talk here. But next, going on, he's reinforcing the Jewish commandments here, right, as binding. So next, in 1 Timothy 6:14, Paul says that thou keep, this is an instruction. He says that thou keep the command unspotted, unblameable, till the manifestation of our Lord Jesus Christ. So here we have Paul, who was Jewish, who kept Jewish law as a follower of Jesus should, as a Jewish follower of Jesus should. And here he is telling people to keep the command unspotted, unblameable. Okay, so how could anybody, including Tovia Singer, say that Paul taught the law is dead and gone? Thank you. Next one, Galatians 3:15, Paul says, brethren, as a man I say it, even of man a confirmed covenant, no one does make void or does add to. So Paul's the one who told us about the new covenant. Is the old one put upon our hearts when he quoted Jeremiah, right? Paul's the one who brought the new covenant concept up into the New Testament. He's the one who talked about covenants like this. And here we have Paul in Galatians saying that God doesn't add to or make void covenants. So how can you have Tovia Singer and everybody else out there saying that Paul taught that the first covenant was made void and replaced with another, when you got Paul right here saying that that can't happen? Right? Thank you. Who's right? Me or Tovia? Thank you. I'm right. Next, in Hebrews 8:10, Paul says, because this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, giving my laws into their mind, and upon their hearts I will write them, and I will be to them for a God, and they shall be to me for a people. So he's quoting Jeremiah's prophecy. But you know what the funny thing is? How can you claim Paul taught that we're not supposed to follow law, it's been replaced by faith, when Paul literally, once again is here saying that the new covenant that we're supposed to follow is literally laws of God upon our hearts and minds? How could you say that Paul taught that we're not supposed to follow laws when he himself here is saying that God's laws are binding upon our hearts and mind? You see what I mean? People, including Tovia, don't know what they're talking about. They literally have just cherry-picked, open up pages, gone by hearsay. They don't pick up the original translation. They don't do a full Christian theological study in the original translation or original language. They don't do that. And even if they did, and they don't come to these conclusions, it means they didn't study it hard enough. Okay? So let's get into part 2 here. What does Paul say about the Gentiles? What do Gentiles keep? Okay, like I said in the intro, Paul taught in the theological conclusion that we see in Acts, where, like I said before, the Jews, the Gentiles, the Christians all got together and were debating and discussing who should keep what laws. And like I said before, it was concluded in those chapters, literally presented as their conclusion, that the Jews should always keep and be zealous of the Jewish law, and that Gentiles should not keep it, but they must keep the Gentile law. And in fact, the Gentile laws, a number of them, are listed out, and this is reinforced 3 times in triplicate. Okay, so nobody could say that I'm wrong. So here we go. In Ephesians 2:15, Paul says the following, and I'll help clear up some other misconceptions with these verses. Okay, so in Ephesians 2:15, this is an example where Paul shows that Gentiles do not need to keep the Sinai law, which is for the Jews. It says, the enmity in his flesh, the law of the commands and ordinances, having done away, that the two he might create in himself into one new man, making peace. Now, to save time for this video, but I get into it in my systematic theology here, showing all the other verses to substantiate it. If you read this chapter and Paul's other chapters, it's amidst where he is discussing what Jew and Gentile should believe, each their own. Now, we know that in Judaism, there's the separation of the Gentiles. Now, if we look in the New Testament, even the disciples of Jesus, because Jesus was Jewish, the disciples were Jewish, even the first apostles were Jewish, and they all kept Judaism, just like historians say, the early Christians who were Jewish kept Judaism. They didn't stop just because they believed Jesus, right? But the problem is that even the disciples, as recorded in the New Testament, even Peter, I think it was being biased against Gentiles and wouldn't include them in the teachings or gatherings. And Jesus had to appear to Peter, and he appeared to Paul and revealed, that I think he appeared to Peter, but in either case, Jesus had to reveal that, no, you missed the whole point of everything here. The Gentiles, righteous Gentiles who reform and turn to the one true God and keep the Gentile law, they are to be, in the flock as well, right? So to speak, the two to become one. Now, the only way you could have, remember, Jesus commissioned the disciples to go throughout the whole planet and convert the people away from paganism into the one true God and to keep the Gentile laws and to reform, right? The missionaries, after the moment of Pentecost in the New Testament, I think it's Luke 24, but in either case, it's in my systematic theology, the verse where they are literally given the first instruction to go spread the gospel in the world of Gentiles is to go and teach all men everywhere to reform, right? So they were given the correct instruction. So if you have a world full of Gentiles who haven't yet reformed and converted, but they need to convert away from paganism into the one true God, you still have that separation. And a lot of the disciples, following the Jewish law fervently, they were still in that vibe of, oh no, the Gentiles should be excluded, and they wouldn't mingle with them. So they had to be reinforced that no, if the Gentiles turn to God and do the right thing, you have to include them. Okay, that's the emphasis of all this. And the only way you can include the Gentiles fairly and legally is by them doing what God said they legally should do, which is keeping the Gentile law, honoring the one true God. Okay, if they do that, they need to be included. Okay, that's Paul expands on this in many places, right? But where he talks about this poetically in Ephesians, for example, people such as Tovia and others misappropriate the poetic and euphemistic language that he uses here. Okay, so it says the enmity in his flesh. What does that mean? The enmity in Jesus's flesh. That's poetic talk. What does that mean? Enmity between Jew and Gentile. Okay, the enmity in his flesh, the law of the commands in ordinances. He doesn't say commands and ordinances. So what he's talking about is that the ordinances, okay, and the Sinai law that is for the Jews alone, these aren't for the Gentiles to follow. This is reaffirmed by Paul later, right? So how can the Gentiles become one? Like I said, they have to follow the Gentile law, right? So in order for the Gentiles to become one body like that, the ordinances and those certain commands have to be done away, because in that sense that the Gentiles aren't going to be keeping them. Okay, that's why it says the enmity in his flesh, the law of the commands and ordinances having done away, that the two, Jew and Gentile, righteous Gentile, he might create in himself into one new man, making peace. That's what that verse and other verses are about. It's about how Gentiles can do the right thing and be righteous and be a part of Israel, right? So in Colossians 2:14, Paul says, having blotted out the handwriting in the ordinances that is against us, that was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Okay? People misappropriate that verse, but it's exactly what I just described with the former. In Acts 21:25, and again, remember, you have to understand who he is speaking to, who the audience is. Is the audience strictly just Jewish, or does it include some Gentiles? You can't tell Gentiles to keep the Jewish law. You know what I mean? You can't tell Gentiles to keep the Jewish law, and you can't tell, the opposite, right? You have to get it right. So in Acts 21:25, this is about the Gentiles. It says, concerning those of the nations who have believed, this is the Gentiles, we have written, having given judgment. This is their theological conclusion, like I said before, and this is reinforced in triplicate in the book of Acts. It says, we have written, having given judgment, that they, the Gentiles, observe no such thing, which is in reference to the Jewish law they're just describing, except to keep themselves both from idol sacrifices and blood and a strangled thing and whoredom. And this is 4 out of the 7, Noahide or Gentile laws that were given in the book of Genesis before Moses. Okay? So, and these laws in this instance is repeated in triplicate. Okay, so 3 witnesses, more than 2 witnesses, 3 witnesses, seals it and concretes it. The people of the nations who have believed, meaning the righteously inclined Gentiles who want to serve the one true God properly. How do they serve the one true God? They keep the Gentile law. This is exactly what Judaism teaches. So Paul is not teaching contrary to what Judaism teaches. He's literally reinforcing it. Okay? Now next in Acts 15:24, again, it says, seeing we have heard that certain have gone forth from us. So Paul's talking about fellow disciples, fellow apostles who are likely fellow Jews. It says, did trouble you, meaning the Gentiles, with words, subverting your souls, saying to be circumcised and to keep the law, to whom we did give no charge. So here is an example where Paul is saying how Gentiles should not be taught to keep the Jewish law. That's not for them. And for them to keep it is actually wrong and bad. It subverts their souls. Now, ironically, as hard to swallow that is for Christians, ironically, Judaism teaches the same thing. They say that Gentiles should not be keeping the Jewish law. I mean, after all, the Jewish Sinai law was literally given in exchange for Exodus. The people of, the Hebrews begged God for release from Egypt through Moses. They got the set of laws as part of their contract of release. That has nothing to do with the Gentiles who are not in Egypt. Okay, it has nothing to do with them whatsoever. That's why that Sinai law has nothing to do with the Gentiles. It's not for them to keep. It's not for us to keep, right? Now, there are righteous principles in those 10 commandments and other various laws of Judaism that are righteous principles that anybody should keep. And that is why Jesus and others talk about elsewhere, love fulfills the law and the prophets, things like that there, because love and righteousness are the underlying core elements that unite all laws and principles of God, right? So anyways, right, getting back to this, Paul clearly said here, seeing that we have heard that certain have gone forth from us, who did trouble you with words, subverting your souls, saying to be circumcised and to keep the law, to whom we did give no charge. That's why Paul says elsewhere that, I don't think I have this verse here as well, but I probably could find it. If I search really quick for the word trouble, I think it might be it. Yeah, Acts 15:19. Let's see. Wherefore I judge. Again, this is a theological conclusion. Wherefore I judge, not to trouble those who from the nations do turn back to God. So again, like I claimed, the Gentiles were taught to reform. That's the gospel from the time of Pentecost. They're instructed to go out and teach the nations to reform, right? Reforming is turning to God, turning from sin. And again, he concretes in what I theologically teach, right? Wherefore I judge, not to trouble those who from the nations do turn back to God, but to write to them, to abstain from the pollutions of the idols and the whoredom and the strangled thing and the blood. Okay, so again, this is just confirming Gentile law for the Gentiles, right? So next, in Romans 2:26, Paul says, if therefore the uncircumcision, and I'll also say this is another case of cherry picking misappropriation. The whole talks of circumcision and uncircumcision. Okay, there's different layers of context to when Paul refers to circumcision. It could be talking about anybody, Jew or Gentile, and it could be talking about your heart, right? If you circumcise your heart, it means you remove the flesh, the sinfulness of it, and you're exposed to God in direct communion with God. You're pleasing God, you're keeping the law, that type of effect. He's taking off the animal fleshly part and being more spiritual in communion with God. That's the emphasis of it. But also Paul uses the term circumcision to refer to Jews and uncircumcised to refer to Gentiles, because Gentiles typically were uncircumcised back in the day, right? So that's something else that you have to keep in mind. So where he says here in Romans 2:26, if therefore the uncircumcision, and by saying that he's referring to the Gentiles who aren't keeping Jewish law, right? So if therefore the uncircumcision, the righteousness of the law may keep, what he's saying there is that if you have a Gentile, a righteous Gentile, he never got the Sinai law, he's not a Jew, he may never even heard the Gentile law spoken from God or a prophet or a teacher, but in his own place in the world, he was just a righteous, good person. And this is what it means. This is what Paul is saying. If therefore the uncircumcision, the Gentiles who didn't know, the righteousness of the law they may keep anyways without realizing it, shall not his uncircumcision for circumcision be reckoned? Now, this is an example where Paul is not talking literally. He's talking poetically and figuratively. He's talking about how the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, if they are righteous, whether they heard a law from God or not, if they are righteous unto God and inadvertently keeping his laws, should not their uncircumcised state be reckoned as if they were circumcised and followers of the law? You see my point? The obvious answer is yes. If you're that righteous that you didn't even have a law and you followed it, then yeah, you're probably better off than those who had law and didn't follow it. So next, Hebrews 7:12, Paul says, and this one's interesting. I wasn't going to get into this, but there's a lot, and I won't get deep into this. I'll just touch on this. It's food for thought, right? The whole thing with Melchizedek and Psalm 110. I'm not getting into that hornet nest of an argument, but I just want to throw this one out there. Now that I've shown some context to the Jew and Gentile situation with Christian theology, okay, this is a very plausible reason why, and check this out, there would have been a change of priesthood or a transfer of priesthood. Now, before Moses, there's Melchizedek, who the Bible says was king and priest unto God. Correct? Yes. Now in Psalm 110, it's talking about the Messiah. Some say it's David, whatever, who cares? Let's say the petty arguments. But in Psalm 110, it says that figure would be a king and a priest. Okay? So more importantly, the more important thing to reflect on is that with Melchizedek, before Moses, on the earth in the time of Abraham, he was king and priest, and there was no Mosaic order. There were no Levites and Zadokites and all of that there. It was just, I'm pretty sure there weren't Zadokites. There was just Melchizedek order, priesthood, and kingship, okay, according to what the Tanakh tells us. Now, where was this here? So if you think about it, everybody on the earth was Gentile then, right? So Melchizedek was a priest of Gentiles, was he not? He was verbatim a king and priest of Gentiles. You read the text, that's verbatim what it reads to you, okay? When you look at it in a more global context, the world being just Gentile at the time, there was no Israel yet, from Moses and all that. Everybody was Gentile. And if Melchizedek is identified by God in the text as being king and priest of God Most High, ruling over Salem, the original Israel and Jerusalem land, then that tells you that the Melchizedek priesthood is a priesthood and kingship that governs over Gentiles. That's common sense. That's not rocket science, right? So if you read in Hebrews 7:12, for the priesthood being changed, of necessity also, of the law change. Now, if you look up the word change there in the Greek, what it means is to transfer from one place to another, okay? Pretty close to what change means, but nonetheless, for the priesthood being changed or transferred, of necessity also of the law change or transfer does come. Now, Judaism has a big problem with this because they say that, Ezekiel talks about in the third temple, there'll be sacrifices and blah, blah, blah. Let's not get into that because Ezekiel could have been talking about the second temple, and Judaism didn't even believe the book of Ezekiel was canon for a very long time anyways, but that's a side argument for another time. The point is that in the world to come, in the new world, in the healed world, when Messiah comes, the scriptures from the Tanakh prophets say that lion will lay with lamb, they will eat straw, there will be no killing, it will be returned back to the state of Eden, with no carnivorism or killing or blood shedding. In that, there is no grounds to say that there will be bloody, ridiculously pointless animal sacrifices that serve no logical purpose. Okay, so forgetting the book of Ezekiel for now, and any other verses people might think allude to such as that, we know from common sense and from the prophets of the Tanakh itself that there will be no sacrifice or bloodshed. And there's also a lot of rabbis and teachings in Judaism that say that animal sacrifices are done away with, and not everybody believes in Judaism that they will be reinstated. There is a division in Judaism. Some people believe that they will be reinstated. Some believe that they don't. I agree with those who say that it will not be reinstated. But nonetheless, so don't let any rabbi fool you that it's only one-way street there, because they do have that division within themselves anyways. My point is all logic, scripture shows that, and common sense shows that there will be no animal sacrifice in the future. Okay? The Mosaic priesthood had a law of animal sacrifice. We could debate on that. I'm not going to get into that debate. The logical fact is, apparently, at face value, it had law of animal sacrifice. So if I heard a noise. Let me make sure a cat's not jumping in my what was that? I have a fish pond outside. No, I think it was something else. If the priesthood is to be reinstated, meaning there would have to be a temple, because you have to have the temple for the priesthood to do all the sacrifices, like everybody knows, right? So if it was reinstated, there would be sacrifices, but we're told from the prophets that there won't be any sacrifices. That's a little hint that that priesthood will not be instated again. Now, again, they'll say, oh, what about the book of Ezekiel? That was probably talking about the second temple period, but let's not get into that side argument, okay? Now, anyways, where it says here, the priesthood being changed of necessity also of the law changing, this isn't as crazy as you think. If, like I said, Melchizedek was the priesthood that ruled over Gentiles, and right after Jesus died, the temple in Israel fell, and you couldn't have the priesthood and the sacrifices anymore anyways. Even Judaism teaches that. Without a temple, God has described to us how we are to live and what laws to follow in the absence of a temple. Correct? I've heard rabbis always teach that, right? So if they're comfy with that they're comfy with the fact that, the temple, the activities of the priest and the sacrifices have ended, okay? it's either they're going to be reinstated or they're not. So you have to admit that they're not going to be reinstated based on all of the other Tanakh prophecies, and also common sense and decency that God doesn't want blood animal sacrifice, like he himself says in the text. Okay, so what I'm getting to is that there's no need for the actual, Mosaic priesthood with its animal sacrifice and such to be reinstated, and it's not going to. That's why in Psalm 110 it alludes that the Messiah will be both king and priest of the order of Melchizedek, because at that point the purpose of the Messiah is to be a light to the Gentiles, not just Israel. That's the whole purpose of the Messiah. Okay, it was also the duty of Israel, but they lacked to do that. They didn't go out and teach the world. So Messiah was supposed to do that as the failsafe. Okay, so again, this comes back to the notion of uniting Gentile, the world of pagan Gentiles, and getting them to convert and reform to the one God. And how do you get them to unite with Israel, with Jews and Judaism? How do you do that? The only way you can do that and have someone governing over it in a priestly and kingly way is through Melchizedek. Okay, Melchizedek has the authority to rule over any, he trumps any Mosaic priesthood, right? Abraham did obeisance to Melchizedek. Okay, and Melchizedek was king and priest over the Gentiles. So the Melchizedek status and position is perfect for uniting Israel, Jew, and Gentile. Okay, so if God in his wisdom knew the future and knew that after Messiah died, Israel would fall, the temple would fall, they wouldn't be able to do the sacrifices, the priestly activities, and all of that anymore. The Jews would be scattered throughout the world amidst the Gentiles, okay, whilst Christianity was being spread, before Catholicism at least. You know what I mean? They were amidst the Gentiles. So how do you unite the two together? The best thing to do is to have Melchizedek priesthood, a global priesthood where the whole world is mixed amidst the Gentiles. That makes the most sense, right? So it's not that, Jesus, they're calling Melchizedek priesthood and all that so that they can get rid of Moses's priesthood. That's not the premise here, right? You see my point? Anyways, moving on. In Acts 17:30, Paul says, "The times indeed, therefore, of the ignorance, God having overlooked, does now command all men everywhere to reform." Now, this isn't the gospel instruction. This is another verse where it says all men everywhere. That's the whole planet. They're commanded to reform. Now, Romans 3:9, Paul says, "What then? Are we better? Not at all." And the reason I read that, by the way, is because the only way a heathen Gentile can come to God, the one true God, is at first by reforming. He has to reform, and then he has to keep the Gentile commands, right? So next, Acts 17:30, the times, I already read that one. In Romans 3:9, in Romans 3:9, "What then? Are we better? Not at all. For we did before charge both Jews and Greeks with being all under sin." So here Paul is saying that as a Jew, are we better than the Gentiles? He says, not at all. For we did before charge both Jews and Greeks with being all under sin. Greeks represents Gentile. Okay, so he is admitting that everybody has sinned. Okay, next in Romans 3:29, Paul says, "The God of Jews only is he, and not also the God of nations?" He's saying it because, yes, he is the God of nations. God is a God of Gentile and Jew. God includes them both. And in Romans 9:24, Paul also says, "Not only of Jews, but also out of nations." Okay, in the same context. So here we have the examples where Paul lays down Jewish law for Jews and Gentile law for Gentiles, maps out how the two can get along and should be getting along as part of the one program. So anyways, real Christianity, that's what it always taught. Everybody else has it wrong. Anyways, God bless you all. Everybody take care. There's no way in a million years Tovia Singer or anybody else come back and say, "Oh, well, you're wrong here." There's no way. They only shake my hand and say, "Oh, you taught me something today. Thank you for opening my eyes." Right? Because once you see the true Christianity, then real true Christians, okay, Unitarian, true Christians who don't believe in human sacrifice nonsense, we could be out there with Israel, with Jews, teaching the real truth, which is Judaism for Jews and Gentile law for Gentiles. Okay, so I know I might be Jewish as far for all I know, but and it is possible based on my ancestry. But as a Gentile, there's very simple things that I have to do and keep, right? I got to love everybody as Jesus instructed for the Gentiles. And we have to love God foremost and love everybody else. Okay. And I'm not allowed to eat or drink blood. Okay. I can't commit whoredom and the basic things. You know what I mean? The basic things. That's what the world has to do. And Gentiles has to do. So anyways, folks, I'd love to see what Tovia Singer has to say on this. I mean, I can methodically disprove him on almost every single thing that he teaches, except for the things that I agree with him on. So anyways, take care, folks, and God bless.